So let me ask you something. What does it actually mean to be German or Austrian today? Like, if you close your eyes and try to picture it, what comes to mind? Is it some traditional, idyllic mountain landscape, or is it a bustling, multilingual city street? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to explore how recent historical shifts and the very real realities of migration have radically altered what it actually means to belong to these nations. Drawing on some really fascinating research from the Edinburgh German Yearbook, we're going to see how modern art, literature, and culture are reflecting and honestly sometimes challenging this rapidly evolving identity.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We've got a very clear roadmap for our journey today. We'll start with culture in the Berlin Republic, then move on to satirizing the refugee crisis, explore the pluralized self, dive into the post-migrant sublime, and finally, wrap up with redefining national identity.
Section 1. Culture in the Berlin Republic and the Return of Political Art.
To really understand where we are today, we kind of have to wind the clock back a bit and see how historical shifts over the last few decades have totally changed the very purpose of German and Austrian art. Back from the 1960s through the 1980s, right in the middle of the Cold War, West German literature was highly political. It was resolutely engaged in its anti-fascism. But then, the Berlin Wall fell. In the 1990s, we saw this massive boom in pop literature that was actually largely apolitical. It focused heavily on a unified, normalized nation. But as you might guess, that apolitical era didn't last. The events of the 21st century, culminating in the 2015 migrant crisis, where over 1 million displaced people arrived in Europe, triggered a sudden, urgent repoliticization of culture. Literally overnight, art was forced to grapple with a brand new reality, the post-migrant society.
Which naturally brings us to a massive, fundamental question. How does a nation redefine itself when the historical norm, the way things always were, literally no longer exists? When the demographic reality completely shifts beneath your feet, how do artists and writers even begin to grapple with these new political fault lines? Well, let's look at a prime example from literature. Moving right along to Section 2, Satirizing the Refugee Crisis.
To see this cultural shift in action, we're going to examine a controversial yet highly successful novel by Timur Vermes, titled The Hungry and the Fat. Vermes uses a pretty shocking counterfactual premise to hold a giant mirror up to society. He essentially imagines a scenario in the near future where a reality TV show tracks a massive caravan of African refugees walking all the way to the German border, broadcast live on television. And Vermes sets up a very stark contrast in his novel, defining two totally distinct groups. On one side, we have the hungry, African refugees who are drawn north by the dream of luxury, personal security, and safety. On the other side, we have the fat, privileged Europeans, specifically Germans in this context, who are intensely eager to protect their resources, their privileges, and their societal status. Now, Vermes creates this extreme binary not to take a political side, but to impartially expose the deep anxieties and motivations driving both groups in this fictional crisis.
Through this totally explosive setup, Vermes launches what is essentially a three-pronged critique of how modern society responds to crises. First up, he targets media complicity. The fictional TV network in the book literally monetizes the refugees' trek, turning human vulnerability into sensationalist entertainment. Second, he highlights political maneuvering, showing politicians who either try to exploit the migrants for cheap labor or build electrified fences just to win over anxious voters. And third, he critiques public apathy. He points a finger straight at audiences who consume this suffering as a spectacle, engaging in what the book frames as narcissistic help rather than genuine, actual solidarity. It is a brutal, unvarnished look at the absurdities of the institutional response to vulnerability. All right, on to Section 3, the pluralized self, philosophy in the public square.
Now let's step away from the macro-level political satire of literature for a second and move right into the everyday public square. How do these massive demographic and political shifts affect the average citizen on a micro level? Well, for that, we turn to philosophy. Now, what's really interesting about a famous campaign poster that was widely displayed in Vienna in 2015 is how it perfectly captures this. Austrian philosopher Isolde Scharm actually uses this poster to explain our current era. The design featured 4 heads viewed from behind. One wears a kippa, one has black hair, one wears a headscarf, and one wears a traditional Austrian Trachten hood. The absolutely crucial detail here is that the traditional Austrian hat isn't placed above the others. It's become just one sign amongst a row of equals. Without Austrian traditions actually changing, the whole context around them has.
Scharm breaks this whole evolution down into what she calls the 3 ages of individualism. In the first age, roughly from the 1800s to the 1960s, identity was all about similitude, basically fitting into a unified national norm.
The second age, from the 60s to the year 2000, was all about asserting difference, standing out, and creating distinct lifestyle enclaves. But today? Today we are in the third age, the era of pluralized selves. We literally live side by side with difference. Our identities are no longer based on a single dominant type, but are constantly shaped by our relationality with people who are different from us. It makes modern identity beautifully diverse, for sure, but also structurally incomplete and a little precarious.
So think about it. If the modern European self is already feeling this precarious and pluralized just walking down the city streets at home, what happens when this identity is totally isolated and forced to confront the vast, terrifying unknown? To explore this, we're going to move from the streets of Vienna to the total isolation of the Atlantic Ocean.
Which leads us to Section 4, the post-migrant sublime, and Wolfgang Fischer's Sticks.
So the crucial point here is understanding a pretty fascinating academic concept called the post-migrant sublime. We're going to look at Wolfgang Fischer's acclaimed 2018 film Sticks. Instead of addressing the migrant crisis in a European city, the film displaces these deep psychopolitical tensions onto the high seas. It follows a lone German yachtswoman who encounters a sinking boat filled with African migrants. This completely terrifying scenario perfectly illustrates this idea of the post-migrant sublime. You know, the classic sublime is that feeling of awe and terror when humans face the immense vastness of nature. But here, the terror and the total breakdown of the European subject happens when the protagonist is confronted with the vast alterity, the profound otherness and suffering of the migrants. The yachtswoman's sudden realization that her European passport grants her safety, while those on the sinking ship are literally left to die by authorities, completely ungrounds her sense of self. It exposes the deep, fatal inequalities in who actually gets to be treated as a full human subject.
And finally, Section 5, redefining national identity, living without a single type.
Okay, let's weave all these threads together. Because whether it's the television screens in Vermeer's novel, the public posters in Vienna, or a lone yacht in the Atlantic, we are seeing the exact same phenomenon play out, the struggle of living without a single, homogeneous national type. As philosopher Eisel Descharmes so brilliantly puts it, one single type does not exist anymore, and that means there is no type anymore. We just can't rely on a singular figure, like the person in the traditional Tochtenhood, to represent the entirety of a nation anymore. The old norm hasn't just been adjusted, it has been entirely erased, and in its place is an active, ongoing, and sometimes highly contested process of community building among pluralized selves.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty big thought to carry with you today. The borders of culture and identity, they aren't just static lines on a map anymore. They're being drawn and redrawn literally every single day in our interactions, our media, and our art. In a rapidly pluralizing world where the old norms are totally gone, how will you choose to define your own cultural identity? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the world around you.